Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Portsmouth Institute's 2021 Summer Conference, As I Have Loved You. Thanks again to our sponsors for making this possible. My name is Mike St. Thomas. I am a teacher and a writer who lives and works at Portsmouth Abbey School, so right here where the Institute is based. I am the English department chair, and I coach and house parent as well here at the school. So today's format, as the other discussions we've had, features a speaker who will deliver remarks for about a half hour. After our speaker delivers his remarks, I will follow up with some questions and start discussion, and then we will hear questions from all of you out in the audience. So please, during the talk today, please submit your questions via the Zoom chat function, and hopefully we'll get some of those asked and answered after. Okay, our session today is entitled Technology and Christian Love, and our speaker is Jason Baxter. Welcome, Jason. Jason is Associate Professor of Humanities at Wyoming Catholic College, where he teaches ancient and medieval thought and literature, art history, and especially the intellectual world of Dante. His academic writing deals with Dante, medieval mysticism, and the Platonic inheritance. And in his popular writing, he talks about the arts, travel and literature, technology and humanism, science and culture, and modernity and modernisms, especially in light of the ancient world. He is the author of 5 books. You can find out more information at jasonmbaxter.com. So welcome, Jason. I am someone who is very interested in how to use technology well, and what it's for and what it's not for. So I'm really looking forward to your talk today. So the floor is yours.
When Chris asked me to do this, I enthusiastically agreed to do so because I've been writing about technology. I've been writing about specifically what I call living in the late autumn of the scientific revolution, and as sort of an exterior methodology for studying nature has become increasingly internalized to the point that we're becoming data selves. That's what I've been writing about recently. But then Chris in the email said this: I suspect there might be an opportunity to integrate some of your research. If possible, perhaps there's a way you can say that it's not all bad, that technology has some redeeming qualities, but if it's all bad, then there it is. And so Chris's request to say something optimistic and positive about technology made me think in a different direction. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, say something optimistic and positive. But please know that in the question and answer session, if you ask the right questions, you can flush out the pessimism. As historians of science have pointed out, instruments and machines played a necessary role in bringing about the scientific revolution. The clock, Torricelli's and Pascal's barometers, Hooke and Boyle's air pumps, Leeuwenhoek's microscope, and of course Galileo's telescope all extended observational powers to such an extent that existing explanatory paradigms were rendered obsolete. At the same time, the old attitude toward natural philosophy as an essentially a contemplative exercise with little connection to practical, artisanal, and mechanical interest was challenged. Most famously, Francis Bacon mocked Aristotelian scholastic philosophers as spiders who spin out useless webs of speculative systems without either making empirical investigations or concerning themselves with the instrumental results. For us, who are the distant heirs of such a background, science and technology have become virtually synonymous in a process that Peter Deere has called the instrumentalization of science, by which he means not only are instruments necessary for making observations which lead to science, but the justification for science is the creation of new instruments. This is also partly what Pierre Hadot had in mind when he said that as moderns we live within the Promethean paradigm. In his posthumously published Veil of Isis, Hadot used Prometheus and Orpheus as a shorthand way of summing up a fundamental tension in the history of Western philosophy. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, is the enterprising, instrumentalizing, entrepreneurial figure who believes that the secrets of nature have to be pried out of her, And once we have them, we can use such secrets to exert power over nature. Orpheus, in contrast, the legendary musician who played so expertly that he could calm wild beasts and cause trees to sway, and who even on a desperate adventure down into Hades induced all of hell to rest momentarily from its suffering, is the figure for Hadot of the contemplative approach to nature, of participating within nature without altering its structure. And although there were Prometheans in antiquity and followers of Orpheus in modernity, Hadot gives Cézanne and Goethe as examples. Nevertheless, the general tenor of modernity is Promethean, technological, instrumentalizing. In this talk, I want to talk about these two approaches to the natural world: the instrumentalized, mechanized, Promethean approach of modern science, and the contemplative, theological, Orphic approach of the ancient world. But in particular, I want to use the thought of the great medievalist C.S. Lewis to ask what it would look like if we fused the two. What if modern science were repurposed to pursue broadly humanistic and theological ends? What if modern means were used to achieve ancient ends? In such a case, we could speak positively about the possibility of technology to promote Christian love. That is, if we could persuade Prometheus to be the servant of Orpheus. Lewis once suggested, somewhat irreverently from the vantage of modern self-understanding, that science and magic are more closely related than modern science would like to admit, because they pursued their crafts with the same end in mind: power. The modern world agreed to what Lewis called the magician's bargain: give up our soul, get power in return. And he characterized the scientific revolution as a period of new learning and new ignorance. Because by choosing to focus on quantifiable measurements and mechanistic explanations to the exclusion of all other types of answers, modern science brought culture into an ethical and social desert, on account of its willful suspension of judgments of value and its decision to strip nature of all her qualitative properties and to ignore its final cause and treat it in terms of quantity. That's from Abolition of Man. In other words, when the cosmos is not perceived as iconic, having a meaning and purpose, it turns into a lump of inert matter passively awaiting for us to dominate it and use it for our own convenience. Lewis put it this way: if we compare the chief trumpeter of the new era, Bacon, with Marlowe's Faustus, the similarity is striking. You will read in some critics that Faustus has a thirst for knowledge. In reality, he hardly ever mentions it. It is not truth that he wants from the devils, but gold and guns and girls. The true object is to extend man's power to the performance of all things possible. He rejects magic because it does not work. But his goal is that of the magician. It might be going too far to say that the modern scientific movement was tainted from its birth, but I think it would be true to say that it was born in an unhealthy neighborhood and in an inauspicious hour. Its triumphs may have been too rapid and purchased at too high a price. Reconsideration and something like repentance may be required. At the same time, Lewis was aware that we could not just pretend and ignore our modernity, and so we have a dilemma. On the one hand, the modern project is epistemologically tainted and requires something like repentance. But the ancient model had a problem too. In Lewis's own words from Discarded Image, I have made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model delighted me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. It is possible that some readers, though, have long been itching to remind me that it had a serious defect. It was not true. How then is it possible to draw anything from a cosmic model, which is not factually accurate? How can the study of such a system be anything but an archaeological interest in archaic history? Lewis had two very creative answers to this question. The first was this: modern science is compatible with the medieval model precisely because a new kind of metaphorical element has re-entered contemporary science interest in modeling and paradigms. Lewis again: I agree, the old model was not true, but I would like to end by saying that this charge can no longer have exactly the same sort of weight for us that it would have had for the 19th century. We then claimed, as we still claim, to know much more about the real universe than the medievals did. But the meaning of the words know and truth in this context has begun to undergo a certain change. In other words, the very idea of what science can and cannot do, as well as how science presents us with its conclusions, underwent a transformation in the early 20th century. In that extraordinary age, light was found to behave as a wave under certain conditions, but also under different experimental conditions as a series of bundles of energy. But what kind of underlying substance light actually is made of, such that it presents as both wave and particles, remains elusive. Lewis followed with interest also the research of the quantum physicists of his day, who famously found unpredictable eccentricities in the movement of subatomic particles, including the unpredictability of the place of electrons in their orbits. At the same time, clouds of gases are known to follow simple laws which regulate the relationship between their heat and pressure exerted upon the walls that contain them. But at the molecular level, the individual units buzzing around are incomprehensibly complex. In other words, we can pose questions to simple underlying levels of reality and get answers with predictive powers. But our answers do not help us get at the essence of what's happening at the deep level. Our observations make up mere models. In this way, for Lewis, the paradigm of building of contemporary physicists who teach the curvature of space and the erratic nature of subatomic movements has striking similarities with the medieval mystic, who paradoxically asserts such things like this, quoting Lewis, quoting Alan of Lille, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Both medieval mystics and modern physicists succeed in suggesting. Each does so by offering what is on the level of our ordinary thinking nonsense. Lewis continues, if I understand the situation, this is just what has now happened as regards the physical sciences. The mathematics are now the nearest to the reality we can get. Anything imaginable, even anything that can be manipulated by ordinary conceptions, far from being a further truth to which mathematics were the avenue, is a mere analogy, a concession to our weakness. Even among themselves, when they attempt to verbalize their findings, the scientists begin to speak of this as making models. It is from them that I have borrowed the word. The similarity, then, is not in the content of the beliefs, but in the shared conviction that our mental models are but metaphorical pictures. Given that there's a gap between the facts we can know, the facts which make up a model, and ultimate reality, all models are to a certain extent like maps with contour lines, useful for general orientation, but not reduplications of the real world. Quote, and going beyond the contour lines, if he knows how to read a map, getting nearer to the reality, end quote. In this way, Lewis was adamant that despite his admiration, he was not recommending a return to the medieval model, but rather he wished to suggest considerations that may induce us to regard all models in the right way, respecting each and idolizing none. No model is a catalog of ultimate realities, and none is mere fantasy. Each is a serious attempt to get in all the phenomena known at a given period, and each succeeds in getting in a great many, end quote. This is the first response to the modern suspicion that because the medieval view of the cosmos was not true, it must be worthless. But Lewis had a second insight into how the medieval model anticipated contemporary science. That is, both modern cosmology and the medieval picture, surprisingly, share the same attitude regarding the peripheral location of human beings in a dazzlingly strange, grand, and varied universe we inhabit. Indeed, the single most characteristic trait which separates 20th century cosmology from its classic formulation is the size and strangeness of the universe. Of course, from the Renaissance on, the modern history of cosmology has been a series of paradigm-breaking discoveries, typified by Edwin Hubble, who have forced philosophers and scientists to reconceptualize the size and speed of the cosmos by orders of magnitude. For instance, in Hubble's day, there was still a debate on exactly what those cloudy nebulae actually were. A leading theory held that they were solar systems in progress, being cooked up in a kind of cosmic oven. The contemporary model of the cosmos, then, was of one great galaxy with stars and solar systems in various stages of evolution. Hubble, though, had access to a newly built telescope at Mount Wilson, which was at the time the largest in the world, and he turned it toward a series of nebulae, including the Andromeda Nebula. He was able to resolve the vague, dusty appearance into specific stars, as well as identify within these nebulae stars which periodically pulse in their brightness, called Cepheids. And because the rate at which Cepheids pulse is related to their absolute brightness, Hubble was able to use them as a great cosmic yardsticks, showing that these nebulae were actually clusters of stars at tremendous distances, whole worlds, infinitely remote. We look out then and find island universes, as he called them, as large or larger than our own. It was an extraordinary discovery which forced a recalibration of the size of the universe. But the universe turned out not only to be larger than expected, but accelerating at mind-boggling speeds. As Marcia Bartusiak put it, in one fell swoop, the visible universe was enlarged by an inconceivable factor, eventually trillions of times over. We had been confined to 1 square yard of Earth's, it would be as if we had been confined to 1 square yard of Earth's surface, only to now suddenly realize that there were vast oceans and continents and cities and villages, mountains and deserts, previously unexplored and unanticipated, end quote. Since Hubble, the universe has only grown stranger. Physicists claim to have discovered the afterglow of the Big Bang and cosmic background radiation, that there are gravitational waves, that there are stars which, though they have the same mass as 2 of our suns, have only a radius, which is about 6 miles long, given that their cores have collapsed in on themselves during supernova explosions. And we know that some portions of the universe are so dense that light cannot escape their gravitational field. Thus, we have a cosmos with an infinite array of cosmological objects spread out throughout infinite space and moving at inconceivable speeds. A world of deep time, deep space, dark matter, dark energy, spiral nebulae, and antimatter. In the popular imagination, these discoveries of modern cosmology have dealt a fatal blow to the alleged ancient conviction that human beings occupied a special part of the universe. Having moved from a universe in which the sun rotates around the Earth to an Earth rotating around the sun, to the discovery that our universe is actually made up of island universes, did not, though, somehow invalidate traditional religious belief. In reality, as Lewis emphasized in almost everything he wrote on the subject, this is a completely mistaken interpretation of the medieval world. In an imagined dialogue published in 1945, Lewis disagreed with the premise. His agnostic friend says, "You see, the real objection goes far deeper. The whole picture of the universe which science has given us makes it such rot to believe that the power at the back of it all could be interested in us tiny little creatures crawling about on an unimportant planet." Lewis, when did people believe that? His friend, why, all those old Christian chaps you're always talking about. I mean Boethius, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Dante. Sorry, says Lewis, but this is one of the few subjects I do know something about. I reached out my hand to the bookshelf. Read this book, Ptolemy's Almagest. Just read that, I said, pointing to book 1, chapter 5. The earth, read out my friend, hesitating a bit as he translated the Latin, the earth in relation to the distance of the fixed stars has no appreciable size and must be treated as a mathematical point. There was a short silence. Did they really know that then? Indeed, it was not just that the medieval model was larger than we might expect, but medieval natural philosophers had a kind of universe-centric awe for the cosmos, an attitude which Lewis captured in the coinage anthropo-peripheral universe. Man was at the periphery of everything that really mattered. The geocentric universe was not in the least anthropocentric, he says, because it made man a marginal, almost a suburban creature. It was not only that everyone knew that the Earth is infinitesimally small by cosmic standards, but also believed that the Earth was made out of the leftover dregs which had first been used to make the purer bodies of stars. A curious agreement with modern speculation. Everything interesting, festive, fiery, light, clean, and harmonious was way out there, while we poor fools dwell at the lowest point of the universe, plunged in unending cold. The Earth was in fact the aufscourings of creation, the cosmic dustbin, the worst and deadest part of the universe, the lowest story of the house. The medieval cosmos then was composed not only of heavens that were steeped in energy, dancing and singing and tingling with vibrant light, but it was also packed full of intelligent creatures of every variety. Whether found in learned accounts classified as daimons or popular accounts which called them fairies, the world was full of airy spirits as well as astral intelligences and other types of longaivi, all reasoning creatures, all with different bodies made up of varying substances, and all of whom possessed reason and desire. The world was full of living marbles and embodied miracles, most of which desired no relationship at all with human beings. Similarly, in the learned poetry of the time, Latin writing poets like Bernard Silvestris and Alan of Lille invented poems of medieval space travel, in which they imagined astral journeys where all these mysterious cosmic forces were met and conversed with. The Cosmographia by Bernard Silvestris, for example, is an exceedingly strange allegorical work which rendered the science of antiquity into an artful allegory. Like Boethius' Consolation, it's a prosimetrum, which means it alternates between Baroque ornate Latin prose and poems which imitate classical meters. Bernard's poem begins with a description of the creation of the world by Nous, which is the classicizing intellect of God, and ends with a discussion of the creation of the human being by a trio of cosmic forces, allegorized as goddesses: nature, Urania, the queen of the stars, and Physis, the ruler of biological life. But in the middle portion of the work, Nous orders nature to travel through the various heavens to seek out Urania. And so nature leaves earth behind, travels upward through the heavens, and is continuously dazzled and left with blinking eyes as she takes in the bizarre universe piece by piece. Does this sound like Christopher Nolan anticipated by 800 years? First, she comes to the region of Anastros, a region on the border of air and ether with light unwavering and calm perpetual. Then she travels along the zodiac and sees a numberless throng, a mob of souls clustered about the boundary of Cancer. Later, she learns that this dense cluster of spirits is waiting to be sowed into the various regions of the world. Some are human souls, some will be heavenly angels, some will be aerial spirits, some will be aerial spirits that hover close to the earth, some will be telluri, spirits who dwell on earth, rejoicing now in green hill and flowery mountainside, now in rivers, now clothed in woodland greenery, there sylvan pans and nereai. All of these lower spirits are to be overseen by someone called the Plutonian Usiarch, whose name is Sumanus. And this is just the beginning of her journey, on which she also meets other Usiarchs, like Pantamorphos. Although unquestionably strange, Lewis, just as he wrote Boethius and Plato in The Last Battle, and rewrote Dante in The Great Divorce, rewrote the philosopher Nicholas of Cusanna in the form of a lyric poem, also transformed this Cosmographia by Bernard Silvestris into his ransom journey to visit intelligent astral races. The narrator concludes Out of the Silent Planet, you might remember, with a description of the letter which solicited Ransom's story. Quote, I am now working at the Platonists of the 12th century, and incidentally discovering that they wrote damnably difficult Latin. And one of them, Bernardus Silvestris, there's a word I should particularly like your views on, the word oyarsis. But on a deeper level, Bernard Silvestris did not just provide Lewis with a plot in need of updating. Rather, he and the whole pre-modern tradition, from Job through the Platonic tradition, turned out to be surprisingly relevant. Their worlds shared fundamental properties with the cosmos of Arthur Eddington and Edwin Hubble. For both medieval and moderns, mysterious entities, hardly understood, emerge out of darkness and present themselves to rapt human observers who can hardly believe what they were staring at, with only partial comprehension. For modern cosmologists, as stated above, the universe is packed full of marvels and strange entities. But for every spiral nebula, black hole, and neutron star, we can find a corresponding Pantamorphos, Urania, and Gramesian in the old authors. In both medieval and modern worlds, human beings are privileged observers of the great cosmic dance, even if they are not the central participants. And so in this way, the anthropoperipheral nature of modern cosmology can lend itself just as much to a religious and poetic sense as the medieval universe, and for the same reasons. The universe, as understood in modern cosmology, is too a great cosmic symphony. Or Lewis adds in language which echoes his description of the Platonic universe, a shadow of an image of God. Quote, "We are inveterate poets. When a quantity is very great, we cease to regard it as mere quantity. Our imaginations awake. Instead of mere quantity, we now have a quality, the sublime. When we are frightened by the greatness of the universe, we are almost literally frightened by our own shadows. For these light years and billions of centuries are as arithmetic until the shadow of man, the poet, the maker of myth, falls upon them. To puny man, the great nebula in Andromeda owes in a sense its greatness. I hope you do not think I am suggesting that God made the spiral nebulae solely or chiefly in order to give me the experience of awe and bewilderment. I have not the faintest idea why he made them. On the whole, I think it would be rather surprising if I had. As far as I understand the matter, Christianity is not wedded to the anthropocentric view of the universe as a whole." End quote. This meditation on the anthropo-peripheral, man at the periphery of the cosmos, view led Lewis to some of his most daring and provocative medieval-inspired thought experiments. The possibility that there are multiple intelligent races spread throughout the universe, all at different stages in their own salvation stories. In his Ransom trilogy, Lewis pictures life on Mars and life on Venus, each of which is occupied by different intelligent non-human species, but whose salvation story is playing out differently. Similarly, in Magician's Nephew, we find Lewis's world between worlds a central hub of portals, which gives access to innumerable worlds at different stages in their development. The world of Jadis, already shriveled up and at its end, Narnia coming into being, and our world, presently lost in the middle of its quotidian struggle to choose real good over evil. What comes as a surprise is how seriously Lewis took the hypothesis. In his nonfiction apologetical works, such as Dogma and the Universe, but also Miracles, we find him repeatedly setting forward speculations which effectively reprise the cosmic world of Bernard Silvestris, now dressed up in the garb of modern physics and sci-fi. But the genius of all this is that even if such a multi-universe reality were true, in which we human beings are just one of many intelligent races on the periphery of our own universe, living out our own version of the salvation story, this does not mean that we are unimportant. In Lewis's imagination, we have to remember that it is Aslan who is judge, Aslan who is maker, Aslan quietly whispering to souls. In this way, every race, however peripheral, is at the center of the Creator's affection. In fact, Lewis goes farther, imagining a world in which every atom exists as if it were the chief object of the Father's affection. In his letters to Malcolm, he says this, with which I'll conclude. "If there is providence at all, everything is providential, and every providence is a special providence. It is an old and pious saying that Christ died not only for man, but for the saint. Christ died not only for man, but for each man, just as much as if each had been the only man that there was. Can I not believe the same of this creative act, which is spread out in time we call destiny or history? It is for the sake of each human soul. Each is an end, perhaps for each beast, perhaps even each particle of matter. The night sky suggests that the inanimate also has for God some value we cannot imagine. The great work of art was made for the sake of all it does and is, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect." End quote. In this way, I think modern cosmology would have absolutely delighted Bernard Silvestris, Boethius, Nicholas of Cusa, and other writers in the Platonic tradition. I also think that by in keeping the medieval model in mind as we do our contemporary science, we recover a way in which we can continue to use our Promethean technologies, but with the contemplative goals of Orpheus. And this provides us a paradigm in which technology can promote Christian love.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Lots to think about. It's good to hear a little bit about the physics that I don't really know too much about, but always sort of seem to fascinate me, especially with, as you said, their ability to sort of displace us from the centers of the universe. So thanks for that. It's really interesting. So I've been taking some notes as you're talking here, and I guess I'll start with kind of a question about this distinction between Prometheus and Orpheus, right? Orpheus being the representative of the contemplative dimension of experience, and Prometheus being sort of the technological instrumentalization, as you said. Just a quick reminder, please submit questions through the question and answer. If you are listening, we'd love to hear what you want to ask Jason. So in going back to that framework, Jason, and thinking about which technologies can aid us in enhancing our contemplation, right? In enhancing our appreciation of the universe, of our smallness in it, but also our unique place in it. How might we define, or I guess my question is, how would we begin to measure how that happens, right? Because you could have certain folks, if you're thinking about the scientific aspects of technology, certain folks saying, well, this technological change actually does enhance our appreciation of the universe, and you have other people quite equally saying, well, this scientific change doesn't actually enhance our contemplation. So, did you have any more thoughts on how that might be sort of measured or evaluated?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a difficult question. It's a question of prudence. It reminds me a little bit of someone, Wendell Berry talks about sort of making the distinction between tools and technologies. Henry David Thoreau says we have to be careful not to become the tools of our tools. So I wonder if even what I said, that in some sense, science is effective when it leads to contemplation, or most effective when it leads to contemplation. But if it leads to isolation, or if it leads to forgetfulness of the uniquely situated human being to see, to find beauty, and then be inspired to worship, it seems to me that those are the sort of general principles. But in terms of like prudentially working it out, I think there'd be a lot of work to do on that. But I think part of the excitement of some of these interesting thoughts in Lewis, of suggesting the rapprochement between the Orpheus and Prometheus, the poet and the physicist, is it's an experiment. I think when we decide to do it, we'll be close toward the beginning of. And we'll have some. I think we have some really interesting paradigms and exemplars of, say, the early scientific revolution, when scientists were still trained in a humanistic fashion, and they still had a sort of ethical and humanistic taste. Someone thinks of like Traherne's Centuries of Meditations, or some of these Cambridge Platonists, or someone like Nicholas of Cusa, who, though on the verge of modernity and beginning to have certain kind of mathematizing and quantifying techniques, still are trained in these kind of old theological traditions. I think they can serve as kind of paradigmatic guides for us. But I think part of the excitement is that if we do this, we're going to be kind of experimentally at the beginning of something, in thinking through the relationship between humanities and the sciences. I think these have huge pedagogical implications for how to do the liberal arts and how to do the great books, as well as how to do STEM.
Great. Again, kind of thinking about this division between Prometheus, Orpheus, between instrument and appreciation. Most of your examples you gave in your talk concern our appreciation of nature, right? Our understanding of the created world. And I liked at the end of your talk how you sort of, kind of gave a caveat, right? Like this isn't, even though perhaps it's important to realize our limited role as human beings in the universe, right? Anthroperipheral, I think, was your term for that. It's important to remember that we are made in the image of God, more than a tree is, as much as a tree can reflect God's beauty. So I think that was a kind of an important thing that you brought up at the end. And I'm thinking about the technologies perhaps that allow us to communicate with each other at the same time that they threaten to isolate us, right? So maybe social media to some extent. What we're doing right here on Zoom, right? This allows us to actually have a conference, even though we would say it's better to be in person. And this is sort of my long-winded way around to a question. How much of this issue of how we use technology, how much do you think are in the technologies themselves, and how much do you think are in our moderate or immoderate use of them?
Right. So it sounds like you're trying to flesh out some of those much vaunted pessimistic thoughts. I think. Okay. Yeah. Now it's okay to be pessimistic. I've discharged my duty to Chris of saying something positive. Right. I think so. I'm just thinking about human beings. Nicholas of Cusa, in many of his interesting works, but as something which he says really fascinating. He in a way which almost kind of anticipates contemporary ecology. He reads the world as sets of infinity. I mean, we now talk about sort of like nesting systems of organization, or sort of ecosystems, which then turn into larger systems, which then turn into larger systems, or sort of nesting sets of infinity, kind of micro infinities. Nicholas of Cusa sees the world and tries to coach this method of approaching it as, say, he imagines, for example, a mustard tree. And he says, imagine that a seed from the tree falls from the ground and sprouts up into a new tree. And then all those seeds fall to the ground, and then they all sprout up into trees. And this process continues to go on. It's kind of like a calculus, 200 years before Newton and Leibniz discover it. But a kind of spiritual calculus in which in the mind we sort of approach these infinite images. Cusanus then sort of says, isn't it amazing, one, that we can imagine something which is so infinitely large that the whole sort of universe could not contain it? And two, isn't it interesting that my mind contains that which even the universe couldn't contain? Because it's not just a single tree, but it's also really anywhere you look, you could conduct these spiritual calculus-like experiments of finding these sort of sets of infinity. So for Cusanus, a way to talk about the unique privilege of being a human being is a sort of not just an example of an infinity, but an infinity of infinities. And in some sense, the more I drink the world in, the more I internalize it, the more I see it, then the more sort of fully realized this inner longing for the absolute and the infinite becomes. And so I think in terms of sort of seeing each other as bottomless contemplative depth does help us, I think in that Cusanus way, help us sort of see the particular privileged role of us interacting among humans. I have some things I could say about, I think Dante also anticipated this in his Paradiso. We could come back to that. So our contemporary technologies, though, I think are largely Nicholas Carr, kind of like Nicholas Carr, the writer on technology, but basically says, look, there's a difference between using a machine and using a technology with fundamentally offloads the responsibility onto a device. At least say, I mean, in a way, like a map is, as a technology, or in a compass, right? But I'm still doing the fundamental act of navigation and orientation in which I'm trying to place myself within space, right? A GPS, though, I'm no longer even doing navigation. I'm just following rote commands. And so for Carr, and I think he's good on this, I think more or less Wendell says something like this as well. There's a fundamental translation in which some technologies create qualitatively different activities and not quantitatively different activities. And I've been thinking a little bit about this recently because I did something crazy. I re-enrolled as a undergraduate physics major in order to put myself in a position where I'll be able to talk about these things with greater accuracy in the future. But actually, being a humanities guy and going back and sort of being trained in a STEM way is starting to lead to some really interesting things. That although, say, if you're doing your calculus, oftentimes you're provided with proofs or explanations. Most of the time, you're given formulas or rules. You're given sort of machines which you crank in order to produce the types of results that you were told previously to have. I think those are kind of, that's an interesting way to think about our technologies. Are they enhancing my own powers of observation? Let's put it this way. If I think the technology will be good for the Orphic purposes I've talked about, if at some point I'm tempted to set the device aside, close my eyes, and I've internalized it. But I think most of our devices habituate us to offloading the responsibility. Because I can look something up on my smartphone, I don't need to know historical dates. I don't need to have chunks of the Constitution or old poems memorized. I can always get at them if I want to. And I'm offloading responsibilities. Now, if you said to me that, well, clearly we could use those devices such that we would need them less, I think so. But I think the whole sort of flow, the whole sort of current is to offload responsibility and thus lay aside my own ability to know and to perceive and sort of postpone it indefinitely until I even forget that was one of the things I wanted to do in the first place, or one of the things that makes me uniquely human.
That's a really important, I think, distinction to make. I think it's one that, someone like Matthew Crawford, if you've read some of his work, you're familiar with his, work on technology and physical matter being important.
Yeah.
What does the technology do, and is it giving us the ability to respond to our environment and think as individuals, right? Or is it somehow offloading? Is it turning us into sheep, in other words, right? This is the conversation I have with high school students and perhaps you have with college students too, about why something like SparkNotes is not really an adequate substitute for reading the book, even though it might give you some helpful guidance in reading a tough passage, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the medievals thought of, and Lewis is really good on this too, the medievals thought of books as dispensable technologies. That is, at some point, reading along enough to a book and you're struck by a wonderful idea or a truth. And now we've all had these experiences. Nicholas Carr thinks we're having them more and more infrequently, and he's probably right. But we've had these experiences in which we come across a passage which is profound and need to reread it 2 or 3 times, and then stick my finger in the book and close the book and want to think about this. And then if I'm in a college, if I'm in a group of people who read together, a collegium, then I want to go and talk to someone, and I want to go through it again and again. We do these kinds of things in which we sort of use our technologies to the point that we realize now is the time to internalize it. And you think about all these wonderful old metaphors through scripture, but also through medieval monasticism of eating the book, right? I ate the scroll and it was like honey unto my mouth, Ezekiel says, when God tells him to eat the book. I think again, that's the sort of these technologies which lead to a deeper interiority. I think that might be a good kind of quick litmus test for what's aiding us in our humanity and what is potentially turning us into a tool.
It's good
to contribute to the GDP.
Yeah. If I may get my plug in for my favorite kind of music, I think this is why jazz music and the improvisational nature of jazz is something that I'm really drawn to. And I'm sure, not everyone shares my affinity for jazz, but you have to internalize the scales. You have to internalize the relationships of the notes, and therefore sort of create them on your own in real time.
Yeah.
just use words. Just we're using words to respond to each other in real time.
Kind of doing jazz right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I
exactly,
mean,
right. We're doing jazz, but without music. We're doing jazz with language.
weren't Mozart piano concertos kind of written as like sort of jazz improv opportunities for the master himself in the middle of it? And then those became sort of formulaically written down. But
I think so. I wish I knew more enough to answer that question with some definitive facts. But I think, I mean, I know certainly in things that Mozart and Beethoven and those folks wrote, there were improvisational passages that were sort of suggested, even if subsequent performers didn't perform them as such. So,
but I just think your mention of music just really quickly is an interesting thing. I think when you start going down to particulars, you read old books and you realize how foreign things are, which ought not to be foreign. For example, like we're one of the first cultures that doesn't really dance. Like we don't dance as a community. I mean, we kind of, at weddings, we might like put on some music and wiggle a little bit, right? But like as a sort of like a way in which sort of grandmothers and grandsons and teenagers can all sort of mix together. We don't dance. You go back and read Homer and there's a description of the Shield of Achilles. It's one of their chief activities. We don't sing. I mean, maybe at church we sing a little bit, but we don't really walk around singing. We walk around listening to our music. We sort of offload the responsibilities to professional music makers. Mm-hmm. I think there are a number of really fascinating ways in which, although we have access to tools, we have access to inexpensively made instruments and instructional videos and all kinds of things. We've sort of left that stuff as sort of something I do in potential and not something which is sort of incarnated even into my kind of, hearth culture.
Great thoughts. Okay, so we have a question here that's from Alvaro. Hello, Alvaro. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for submitting this question. And Alvaro says, would you say that all the phenomenon you explained and that science keeps discovering every day are the reflex or the reflexes of God? And Alvaro says this: it made me think about the sacramentality of the world. If so, in your opinion, how can we read science and the world in a sacramental way, in an atmosphere that is mostly atheistic or skeptical in the scientific world?
Yeah, what a cool question. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is something that Lewis's friend Owen Barfield said in his book on this subject, Saving the Appearances. He said that we have to go through modernity, not away from it. Through, not back. In other words, I think we can admire the sacramental, liturgical, iconic nature of the medieval cosmos. But I think if we try to force ourselves to have those feelings in the same way that they did, at least in me, it leads to coldness. I mean, for example, Isidore of Seville has these allegorical readings in which he says, look at the volcano and how it erupts with its fiery presence. This reminds us of the fiery judgment of that awaits those who are wicked, and sort of like wants to get from the natural world to the kind of moralistic theological readings so quickly that I think it leaves modern readers cold. And so I think we have to go through. And so I think I think we have to completely engage with contemporary science. But it seems to me that if we are also doing something which is humanistic at the same time, we're also providing for ourselves interpretive paradigms for the science that we're doing. But I guess in a way I might not satisfy our attendee. I guess in a way what I'm calling for is to begin an experiment, and I'm not exactly sure where exactly it will entirely go. I'm also thinking of Charles Taylor's excellent essay, A Place for Transcendence, in which he says in 12 pages what he also says in 700 pages in A Secular Age. But he says that having sort of described very carefully what he talks about the immanent frame, which I think we could read as synonymous with the atmosphere of mostly atheistic and skeptical or skepticism in the science world, right? Taylor talks about this immanent frame, talks about how we got here, but says, and nevertheless, we have these sort of cracks within the immanent frame. And he has this, arresting metaphor in which we go and put our fingers in these existing cracks and then try to pull and try to widen those cracks in order to try to create a space to see transcendence, and yet from within the perspective of immanence. So I suppose I would say, let's do that. Let's pursue our contemporary science from within the immanent frame. And yet by trying to be nourished by what Lewis called the old books. At one point, he famously recommended reading one old author for every new author you read and trying to put them in this grand dialogue. Then maybe we can find those sort of cracks within the immanence. And even then, we can begin a conversation with our skeptics. I don't know if Alvaro thinks that that's too tenuous or too hypothetical of a project, but that would be how I try to take a shot at that.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question comes from Stefan. Stefan says, Jason, very interesting talk. Thank you. I'd like to hear of Lewis's rapprochement between modern and medieval worldviews regarding the subjection of the Promethean to the Orphean. What would you say to the scientist who says, as I recently heard on public radio, not only is it not a sin to investigate something like human cloning, it would be a sin to not investigate it because we seem to be close to having the power to do so. And Stefan asks, is this not already a subjection of the Promethean to the Orphean theological domain? So what should repentance or rapprochement actually look like?
Right. That's a great question. I've recently come across a book called Enhancing Evolution. I wonder if I should even mention it and boost its Amazon sales. Enhancing Evolution by an Oxford philosopher called Harris. I feel like he's sort of like an English Peter Singer who sort of made his fame and wealth by means of arguing explicitly for these kinds of transhumanist projects. I'm sure a lot of the attendees are aware that 2 months ago, I read this in the New Atlantis. 2 months ago, scientists mainly in China announced that they had successfully injected human stem cells into a monkey embryo and are proclaiming that they will soon have the ability to technologically grow human organs, which will be housed in these subhuman creatures until we desire to pluck them like a liver from a tree. So, I mean, someone like Harris would basically say, if we can do it, we should. I think, how do you even begin addressing that type of transhumanist project, which is so clearly aware of its principles? I think most of the time we're engaged in ethical debates, it's with people who were, more or less kind of Christian heretics, right? In the sense that they maintain Christian ethical positions, which they no longer have a metaphysical or ontological claim to, and yet they haven't realized it. They're sort of, but every now and then you do come, and I think this is becoming increasingly common, of the self-aware transhumanist who, someone like Sam Harris, who is beginning to say that Christians are the evil ones because we're not willing to do everything possible to transform the world into our image. Well, I would say that the beginning to an answer to Stefan's excellent question is this would completely obliterate any approach to the world which resembles the Orphic tradition. If the world, and in some sense, it's the absolute and radical perfection of the Cartesian project, right? In which a human being is nothing more than an agent, or in our contemporary terminology, nothing more than consciousness. Therefore, the rest of the world is just matter existing in energy, waiting for me to do anything I please to do to it. I can restructure my body. I can change who I am. I can implant technologies, and I can do it to the world surrounding me. If you do that, though, you completely obliterate the ability to read it. The contemplative aspect completely evaporates because it's reduced to nothing but what Heidegger called standing reserve, matter waiting for me to engineer it according to my desire.
Good. Excellent. Another question. This gets back to our discussion of sort of the modern technologies that connect us with each other. This question says, to what degree does social media or virtual reality actually create the anthropocentric view of the cosmos that the moderns wrongly critique the medieval thinkers for holding?
Yeah, I love that. I think that goes really well with what I was trying to say toward the end of my answer to Stefan's question. That is, if the world is nothing but inert and passive matter awaiting for me to engineer it into something which I desire, I think the sort of the social media and virtual reality does something similar. That with a sort of constant focus on the exercise of my own imagination and turning the image of myself into how I wish to be, even if it doesn't measure up to real accomplishments, or to just sort of manipulating reality in order to perceive it in a different sort of way. I think you're right. I think it just creates a series of kind of radically isolated, subjective individuals who consider the only important thing is their perception and manipulation of the reality around them. Again, as opposed to this older view, which fundamentally sees the privilege of being human as the ability to read these infinite sets of infinity. And that if I sort of continue in this project as discovery of the natural world, but as well as sort of discovery of my friends, the sort of gift of friendship, then I am endowed with ever greater capacity of worship and gratitude and a perception of beauty. But that requires me sort of embracing my own creaturehood, and fundamentally acting as a reader, or as bringing a sort of contemplative attitude toward the natural. And I think when we created these sort of spaces of virtual reality and social media, we forget that we're supposed to be readers, and we think of ourselves exclusively as sort of producers and manipulators, even of my own conscious experience. And thus we cut ourselves off with access to this text of infinite sets of infinity, nature.
Good. It'd be interesting, and maybe perhaps in another time, to kind of flesh out some of the ways in which technology, especially modern social media technology, is tied to corporate interest, right? And what it would be like if these technologies weren't maybe, engineered to get our attention at every single moment of the day. Last questions along the same lines about the medieval view and finitude here. Last question says, would it be fair to characterize the medieval model as the more intellectually humble model compared to the modern framework? There appears to be universal human wrestling with finitude and grasp for power to overcome this finitude in modern times. Meanwhile, medievals seem to be at peace with their finitude. Would it be fair to characterize medievals as knowing the limits of humanity?
Yes. Well, I think this participant anticipated what I was trying to say in my response, but absolutely, I think if we could talk about it and understand the kind of almost metaphorical way in which I'm using this term, the medieval viewer feels that his chief responsibility with respect to the natural world is reading. And by which I mean something like developing the power to perceive the radical abundance and giftedness of the world. And that requires learning, that requires study, that requires, well, and it calls forth an ethical transformation. But I think that's what we have radically lost as we have moved into what I've called the late autumn of the scientific revolution, is what our questioner calls that humility, that creaturehood, that finitude. Completely agree with that. And what I've seen is, if you're speaking to an audience of, iGen or Gen Z folks, those who are kind of, teens and 20s right now, what gets them to sort of sit on the edge of their seats is to talk to them about how they feel sort of like lost ghosts, looking for a place to incarnate, even in their own bodies. This is something that they have extreme anxiety over. But I think in some sense, what culture offers them are all these different types of impoverished languages, and says, this is what you're looking for. And thus they have this sort of habitual attitude of reserve and of skepticism, and thus feel deeply, deeply lonely and deeply anxious. But I think it's in part because we've given them this radically limited vocabulary, this radically limited language, and asked them to express their longing for the absolute, for the infinite, for God, for holiness, for friendship, for intimacy, for love, for fidelity, in all these kind of unnourishing, reduced vocabulary. And I think, I'm sure all of our participants know that these Gen Z is, within modern record keeping, first generation to commit more suicides than homicides. They're less violent, but they're more self-loathing than anyone has ever been. And I think they don't feel, because of our limited vocabulary that we offer them. That is, in other words, when we give them a merely sort of subjective view of the world, that you can manipulate reality to what you wish it to be, you don't even know why you want to do that. So to restore this Orphic approach to the world, where it's too rich, it's too beautiful, it's too interlocked, it's too good to be true. The sort of saturated abundance of the world, I think, is something that our students, our high school and our college students, if we can get them to pay attention for long enough, if they haven't already had all of their powers zapped in the microwave of social media, then they're really moved by it, and I think begin to hunger for this sort of thing. So I just saw one little question about my school, Wyoming Catholic College, famously or infamously not allowing students to have cell phones on campus. Absolutely. The students come to campus and they all, not all of them, but many of them go through serious withdrawal symptoms. They wouldn't call it like that. But quit coffee for a day, or smoking or whatever, right? And you go through withdrawal symptoms. They go through withdrawal symptoms, and they have this sort of like nervous kind of like itching desire to reach for something, especially in sort of like, awkward social moments, right? If you have your device, you look temporarily important, and you don't actually have to confront people around you. Make small conversation, right? Sherry Turkle, the sociologist at MIT, wrote a book for her students called How to Have a Conversation, or something like that, right? It's a famous course in which she teaches things like how to go on a date and things like that. But I think by sort of removing this thing which allows you to sort of warp into this world and look important, all of a sudden you're forced to deal with these human beings face to face, eye to eye. And everyone who visits campus says that that's the most remarkable thing, that they discover a community of people who are looking at each other and smiling at each other and interacting, and everyone says it feels very strange.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. No, it's a good note to end on, a positive note like that. I think, from my perspective as well as a teacher, I've been teaching high schools for 13 years. I recognize the same things that you do. But I'm also encouraged by the opportunity this presents, to educators, right? People are hungry for real things. And I think I think we have a real opportunity in this generation to sort of show them what is real.
Yeah, well, the gospel is written on the heart, and it's eternally desired. And so the hungrier people become, then at least the more interested they're going to be.
Exactly. Great. Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you so much, Jason. Really fascinating discussion. Lots to think about for me, I know, and hopefully for everyone else out there too. Thank you to our sponsors. And thank you to all of you who are out there listening, watching, and submitting questions. And we will wrap it up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.